Virginia Postrel. Welcome to my podcast. My inaugural guest is Dean Ball, who writes a terrific Substack newsletter called Hyperdimensional and is a research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, specializing in artificial intelligence and progress. In this conversation, which was recorded on September 9th, we talk about a lot of things. We talk about AI, of course, but we also talk about nuclear fusion and hard tech. We talk about the evolution of knowledge and the future of classical liberalism. And we talk about Dean's love for the philosophical writings of Michael Oakeshott. Let's get started. Hi, Dean.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Virginia.
Sure. Thanks for being my guinea pig. So like a lot of people, I first discovered your work when you wrote a post on your hyperdimensional Substack called California's Effort to Strangle AI. So what was that all about?
That was about a bill called SB 1047. Which was introduced by a state senator named Scott Wiener, who represents the San Francisco area. So this is a state bill, not a federal bill.
Right.
But its ambitions are federal and indeed kind of international in some ways. The idea would be to regulate large scale, so what is called in the industry frontier AI models that are trained. Well, they've had different thresholds in different iterations of the bill, but the idea is the biggest models, and by any company doing business in the state of California. So if they have a single employee, if they distribute the model in California, etc. So this certainly would apply to anybody in the United States, certainly well beyond California's borders, and it could in theory apply beyond America's borders. And basically, the bill does a lot of things, but the basic idea behind it is to make developers of those models legally responsible for serious harms that are accomplished by users of the models downstream of them. So, in other words, the developers have no control over what of what the users are doing necessarily. In the case of an open source model, truly none. OpenAI can surveil your usage of their models because it's a closed source model and you're on chatgpt.com, which is their property. But there's also open source models where you can download the model and use it on your own computer or on your own, servers or whatever you want. And that way the developer can't see what you're doing at all. And yet this bill would make it so that developers of those very large models would be legally responsible for harms above $500 million. So one way to think about this is like, every cyber attack that's ever happened, by definition, has been materially enabled by the existence of computers and software.
Right.
And yet, so in other words, people have used laptops to accomplish well over $500 million in damage in single incidents. And yet, it's not as though Apple would be responsible legally for that, or the person who made the operating system, or the person who made the web browser, or the programming language, or whatever else. It's all just software made by other people. And so this is really not the way that liability has worked in software and in the computing industry more broadly, for the most part. And I think probably the success of those industries is deeply connected to that fact about the American liability regime. And so changing that for AI is a quite radical step.
Right. Right. And it's not even just software where this would be a radical step. I mean, if somebody buys fertilizer and makes a bomb and blows up a building, the fertilizer company is not responsible for that.
Right.
There are plenty of tools that we have that are made for innocuous purposes and are very, very useful to us that can in the wrong hands. The other example would be books. Suppose you get a book that tells you how to make a fertilizer bomb, and then you go and you make the fertilizer bomb, and neither the publisher of the book nor the fertilizer manufacturer are responsible. You're responsible.
Right, right. And, another analogy I often use when I think about the liability for this stuff for AI is a car.
Yeah.
So if I'm driving a car and I am not paying attention and I hit a pedestrian, the legal liability for that is almost certainly on me and not on the person who made the car. But if, on the other hand, my car is well maintained and I'm paying attention, but my car's brakes fail, that may well be on the manufacturer of the brakes or the manufacturer of the car.
Right.
And the reason that that's a coherent legal regime is that we have a quite concrete sense of what it means for a car to be malfunctioning.
Right.
In a way that we don't quite have for something like a large language model.
Right. Right.
Now, will we be able to develop technical standards over time like that? And also, certainly applying aspects of the common law in certain kinds of edge cases, to determine, okay, well, this really was like kind of a product defect that the user could not reasonably have been expected to know about, and it caused some kind of harm. Sure, I think over time, we'll be able to build that, but that will be a time-consuming and sort of complex technical problem.
Right.
And I think rushing headlong into a liability regime like the one SB 1047 proposes is probably an unwise move.
Right. And the bill has been amended since your first post, and you've written additional posts about it. It has now passed the legislature, and we are waiting to see, we in California and the world are waiting to see whether Governor Gavin Newsom will sign it or veto it. And it's an interesting case because this bill, both the opponents and the supporters, cross party lines. Elon Musk likes it. Nancy Pelosi doesn't like it, but it has a Democratic sponsor, Scott Wiener, who is a hero to many people in the pro-housing movement, where he seems to understand the downsides of certain kinds of regulation, but he's not applying that. What do you think is going on, and do you have any sense of what's likely to happen next?
It's a great question, what's going on. We're seeing interesting political fissures kind of forming here. And I don't entirely know what to make of it yet. One way to think about it would be people that are convinced that AI represents kind of a fundamentally different sort of technology that needs to be regulated in radically different ways. And
Elon Musk falls into that category. I mean,
yes, he does.
I reviewed the biography of him, and he's like been one of these AI catastrophists like since forever.
Exactly. And then there's other people who run a spectrum of people who are absolutely convinced that AI is not that kind of a risk, that it's not like an atom bomb or something. And then I'd say you have people like me who are a little bit more in the middle and sort of just saying, look, I hear the arguments on both sides. Right now, the evidence seems to be, I can only react to what I see. And the evidence from current models is that they don't pose that kind of a threat. And I would rather wait until models do start to pose more serious threats and kind of see what those are and make a law that's tailored specifically to that. I think the costs of regulating models in anything like the way that SB 1047 accomplishes it are very high. And so we should expect there to be a high burden of proof for doing this. So that's kind of where I find myself, really more trying to foster more insight about these things rather than sort of pushing for government oversight. And then to answer your question on like where I see it going, my hunch is that Governor Newsom will probably veto the bill big portion of the California delegation in Congress has spoken out against it, not just Nancy Pelosi, but more than that. Fei Li, who is one of the most respected AI researchers in the world at Stanford University, often called the godmother of AI, is also a vocal opponent. So I would be surprised, as is much of the tech industry, of course. But that kind of goes with that saying.
Not exactly. We'll go to that, but finish your thought.
Yeah. So I'd be surprised if Newsom, signs it, but my confidence in that is not super high.
Right. One of your points in the original post was that there are certain companies within not just the tech industry, but within the AI world who would benefit from this. That there's a kind of political economy here going on, that there's some interest group. Can you explain why any AI company would support such a regulatory bill?
Yeah, well, so in theory, the kind of idea of regulatory capture would suggest that as legislation like this becomes law, the only companies that will be able to successfully comply and sort of have the cost structure to bear the legal risks associated with it would be the largest players. Now, of course, what the proponents of the bill would say is that it only applies to the largest players, which, fair enough. But one problem is that it disincentivizes those large players from ever open sourcing their models. And what may well be a problem for startups is that many of them might want to build on an open source frontier model made by like a company, Meta has made. Maybe
you, for those who don't know, explain the difference between an open source AI model and a closed AI model.
Of course. So open source, I'll start with closed source because that's the easiest thing to understand. So closed source is like ChatGPT, or another example of closed source software would be the software on an iPhone. You can't, for the most part, access the code that Apple wrote to make the software on your iPhone, and you cannot access in a AI model the equivalent of code is the weights of the model, which is basically the collection of numbers that define the model's capabilities and behavior. So in a closed source model, you can't access that. In an open source model, you can, and they're actually just they're put on on the internet and made available for free for download. It's essentially a big collection of numbers and a little tiny bit of code that you can use to implement the model. And that gives you a couple of benefits. First of all, like I was saying earlier, it prevents if security and privacy of what you're doing with the model is important to you, open source is ideal because the company that made the model can't surveil your usage of it. There's also additional flexibility you can get. And in addition to that, I think one maybe somewhat underrated or non-obvious thing is that it's also, open source is also very good for academic research, especially safety research. Because one of the things about neural networks is that we don't entirely understand how they work. And so you need access to the weights, which is like the, almost like doing an fMRI, like a brain scan of the model. You need that access in order to do good safety work, a lot of safety research a lot of the time. So there's all kinds of these benefits. And what SB 1047 almost certainly does is increase the marginal risk for any of these large players to release an open source model at the frontier of AI. So
because you never know who might use it, and you can't track. You can't keep track. Don't know what they're doing with it because it's on their computer and not on yours.
Yeah, exactly. And so Meta has released, at this point, models that their most recent open source model series is called Llama 3. Almost certainly these models cost hundreds of millions of dollars to train. And you can just download the entirety of them for free on the internet. So So I think that would be a real problem for startups too. One thing that's interesting to note, though, on the regulatory capture point is that I actually don't think in this case that companies like, the big frontier labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, I actually don't think that they were lobbying for this bill.
Ah,
Um,
so
and
where did it come from?
I think it truly came from Scott Wiener, who is worried about, I think he's very genuine. I think he is sincerely concerned about AI safety, for one. And I think secondarily, Scott Wiener and California's legislature more generally certainly think of themselves as America's tech regulator.
Yeah.
They see that the federal government is not regulating here, and they see an opportunity to do it because they define any absence of regulation as, inherently irresponsible. And so they see an opportunity to kind of play act as the adults in the room.
Right.
And in fact, the other group of people who saw this opportunity and seized on it were, of course, the European Union.
Yeah,
which passes similar legislation. And it's worth noting that the European Union sent delegates to Sacramento to consult on SB 1047 and a few other AI bills in the state.
Right. I want to completely shift gears for a moment and get you to talk a little bit about your career, because you have a really interesting pathway to where you are now that is quite different from the graduate school to academia professor route, and also different from the path that we ancient folks who came up in journalism like Jonathan Rausch or me or some of the folks at Reason came through. I just want you to tell people how you got to where you are.
Yeah, sure. It's a weird and circuitous story for sure. So I was pretty interested in like computers and math and science and stuff like that in high school. Mm-hmm. I also loved the humanities, but I kind of went to college thinking that I was going to go into some kind of a STEM like field. And I stumbled into a reading group. It wasn't even a class. It was like an extracurricular reading group. My fall semester of my freshman year, where they were reading Friedrich Hayek, Constitution of Liberty, Road to Serfdom, things like that. And I had really no context for who Hayek was. I just kind of read the ideas and judged them from first principles, so to speak. And it turned out that I fell in love with them, and I thought it was these deeply elegant ideas. And my immediate intuition was that Hayek was more than just an economist. He was a kind of natural philosopher.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Like in the 18th century sense of the term, like he understood something fundamental about the way nature works, and economics is one growth, one offshoot of that, but far from the only one.
Right.
So I would start, citing Hayek in papers and in class, and I realized that Hayek's ideas were not so well received by many, of the professors that I had, and from there.
And where were you in college?
Hamilton College is a school in upstate New York, and so I kind of realized, wow, like, people need to understand this stuff. So I kind of just got attracted to the world of ideas from there. And then after, a few years of study, I ended up being a history major, intellectual history for the most part. And I fell in love with like the idea of urban governance. I had never thought about, it was a book called Triumph of the City by Ed Glaeser that really changed me.
That book. And
Ed, yeah. And I had just never thought about the idea that cities also had governments, and
how did you think they?
Yeah, I just I would have assumed that they did. I never thought about like, oh wow, like New York City has a whole, apparatus and a police department bigger than some countries' militaries and stuff like that. So Ed Glaeser was associated with an organization called the Manhattan Institute. And I interned there and got hired there to sort of do state and local policy, and then basically did management type of work at think tanks and other intellectual nonprofits for about a decade.
Okay.
And then decided that really the best and most lasting contribution I could make instead of management for my personal skill set would in fact be writing. So I shifted to writing basically in the last year.
And at some point along this way, you spent, I guess, a year or so, maybe it was when you were in studying the work of Michael Oakeshott. And I wonder, Michael Oakeshott is even less well known to Americans than Friedrich Hayek. So I thought maybe you could explain who he was, why he attracted your interest, and what the connection was.
Yeah, so I first read Oakeshott in college. It was the same group student organization that introduced me to Hayek. Few years later, I read Oakeshott and his book Rationalism and Politics. And I found Oakeshott to be just an incredibly beautiful thinker. And specifically this idea that he talked often about, rather than trying to build a systematic philosophy, he was interested in cultivating a sensibility. And he had a real skepticism of goals and plans and purposes and destinations and even origins, right? Things like that. And I found that deeply appealing and, again, quite resonant with things I had learned about the way nature works. He criticized Hayek, in fact, famously as having a plan for an unplanned society, which is a nice quip. So I wrote an essay about Oakeshott. My thesis in college, one of them, was an essay comparing Oakeshott and ancient Chinese philosophy, because I thought there was something really interesting going on there too, between those, between especially Confucius and the Taoist philosophers. So I wrote that, and that ended up being published in a small academic journal. And then I didn't write anything for 10 years, really. I mean, not publicly, but I continued to love Oakeshott. And basically, when I decided to start writing about AI, I decided that the best way to do that would be to approach it through Oakeshott's sensibility, and kind of like try to think to myself, like, let me use Oakeshott to think through what I actually think about AI, because I didn't know at the time.
Yeah.
So that was an essay that I wrote. I presented it at a conference on Oakeshott's work about a year ago.
Right.
That was the first thing I wrote on AI.
Yeah. Interesting. As I said when we were setting this up, I did not see that Oakeshott connection coming, knowing your work on AI. So let me getting back to AI, I have this theory that for a lot of people who are not in the industry, their anxieties about AI are less about sort of Terminator scenarios and more about, oh my God, it's yet another thing I have to learn if I'm going to stay employed. Geez, will it ever stop?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, A, do you agree with that? It's just a theory. I don't have a lot of evidence for it. And B, sort of how do you use AI yourself, and how do you keep up with the field?
All good questions. I think that there is definitely something to that. I've seen there are polls out there that I think are not so great at finding the truth, but I've seen some focus group results that make me think that there's something to that idea, that people are more concerned about what in the AI community we would call short-term risks.
Yeah, right. We live in the short term, most of us.
Yeah. So, that would be deep fakes, or just being confused about it, right? Like, how does this thing work? How is it doing what it's doing? And I totally get that. And in terms of, using it, it's interesting. I kind of compare a language model like ChatGPT to the piano, right? They say the piano is the easiest instrument to pick up and the hardest one to master. And I think that's true, because you really can, you can just go to ChatGPT and say whatever you want. and it will respond to anything. You know, there's nothing where it's gonna like say I give you an error. But the problem is, of course, you know, as most people know now, it can hallucinate, get stuff wrong. It, you know, it has all, it's weird, right? They're just weird. And if you don't, their quality is dependent on, the quality of their answers is dependent upon the quality of your question. Which is kind of true generally in life. But is certainly true of these language models. And in terms of how I keep up with or first how I use models, so my primary use case, first thing, I get asked this a lot, especially because I tend to write kind of a lot. I don't know, I guess. And people ask me like, are you able to maintain your output level with AI? And the answer to that is no.
No, I can tell. It's not an AI voice in your work. It's a person's voice.
Every single thing I write is blank piece of paper. Occasionally, I will actually quote a language model in my work if I think the language model said something smart, which occasionally happens. But for the most part, nothing directly on writing. What I mostly use them for is to keep up with sort of like academic papers. I can read 10 times more academic papers or learn from 10 times more academic papers than I could previously, because rather than having to read each one myself, I can sort of triage and say, okay, well, I want to read this one personally, but these other 9, I can just, throw into a language model and, basically have a conversation with the paper using an advanced language model. So that's a very big use case for me. A couple other, like, I'll use them to write the occasional little bit of code. I might use them for a little bit of data analysis. I might, sometimes if I have to write something very pro forma, like a cover letter for an application or not, maybe not even that's a good example, but like an abstract for something, you know, I will occasionally do that. I actually keep a document of everything I've ever written publicly that I will sometimes upload to a model and say, here's this thing I need to write, and here's everything I've ever written. Please write something in, my voice.
Right. And does that work?
Yeah, it does. They do a pretty good, I mean, it all depends on the model you use. I personally prefer Anthropic's models, the Claude line of models from Anthropic. And they tend to be, Anthropic's models are known in the field as being pretty good at writing. And that's actually, that answers your last question too, in terms of how I keep up with the field. It's really, it has a lot to do with like reading primary source sort of machine learning papers. Also, the normal stuff, Substack and Twitter and podcasts. AI community is a very online republic of letters. There's not a lot of traditional op-eds that are going on.
So that's interesting. If there are not a lot of, I think that's my observation too. But if there are not a lot of op-eds going on, I mean, when you're starting to talk about things like legislation and regulation, just talking to each other is a problem.
It's definitely true. And I would say, like, I should amend that statement to say there are a ton of op-eds that get written, but for the most part, I would say those op-eds don't tend to get to bubble to the top of the surface within the AI world.
Because they're not very good, or because they're telling people things they already know, that people in the community already know?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's telling us stuff we already know. I mean, it's a little bit like an op-ed, unfortunately, this is kind of just a pressure that's going to, I think, increasingly come bearing down on traditional media. Because traditional media has to reach such a wide variety of people. You kind of have to have these averagey, middle of the road types of pieces. You can't go too deep into anything or be too weird. And unfortunately, in an era where LLMs can write stuff, that's a problem, because an LLM can write most op-eds.
Oh, no. Well, the pay for op-eds is already terrible. So, for your typical op-ed. So I know it's old-fashioned of me to actually care about the pay, but that's how I make a living. So going back to kind of Oakeshott and Hayek and the connections between that and AI. One of the things you've written about, and you've written an essay on this, is the idea that everything is constructed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like, what do you mean by that, and what are its implications?
Yeah, so I mean, in a literal sense, it is just the case from our best understanding of physics that literally every property of the world is the emergent result of the interaction of quantum fields, right?
Right. So is constructed is, in a sense, not the right verb, because that sort of implies a kind of intentionality or an actor doing the.
Yeah, I mean,
it's more
the
like
problem,
construct itself. It constructs itself.
Yeah, the problem with emergent orders, and I'm sure you've thought about this before too, is it's a problem with they don't interact well with the English language.
Yeah, that's
because
true.
The English language wants there to be an actor.
Yeah.
And so that is a problem. Now, I think, I would also say like that's true of, everything in the human world also is too. So like one thing that I think is just, it's a difficult point kind of, but a lot of people in the AI world will talk about the future as though it's a thing that exists, right? Like,
right.
What's going to happen in the future? And one of the points I try to make all the time is that the path between now and whatever point you imagine in the future is itself like being constructed in real time by human actors and other things.
Right.
And so the future does not exist, right? Whatever future you're imagining, like, it does not exist. And there's like branching paths. And so yeah, when I would say like in a literal sense, that's true, but also I think in a sort of a broader sense, knowledge, right? Like knowledge is constructed.
Right. Yeah.
There's very few, and this is important for AI. I think there's this idea in the AI community of creating like an exquisite mind whose world model is so good that it could intuitively, like in the way that you intuitively know what the smell of cinnamon is, it could intuitively know what a protein is that cures cancer.
Right.
And I think that that's probably not how knowledge actually works.
Right.
I think that it's scaffolding and it's built over time. And so could we accelerate the acquisition of knowledge? Absolutely. And I think we will. I think that's happening right now. But can you make a godlike thing that can sort of in its brain conceive of nanotechnology sort of de novo? I'm skeptical of that.
Right. And one thing I think, just from a business standpoint, or, that this vision, this dominant vision, or dominant among the, I don't know what you call them, AI intellectuals, of a single, all-encompassing artificial mind. One thing I suspect it gets wrong, I mean, this is my theory, is that from a business standpoint, that's not what we're going to see, or from a consumer everyday use standpoint, we're going to see a lot of little specialized people taking these open source models. This goes back to our discussion of open source, and applying them to very specific circumstances, kind of using their local knowledge about, what is needed in a particular piece of, human reality, and making a little AI model. I don't know what you think about that, or if I'm thinking in the right categories.
I think we will probably see both things.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that, I mean, the goal of a company like OpenAI,
right,
or Anthropic, is to create artificial general intelligence.
Right. Yes.
And the problem with that is that we don't know what intelligence is. I don't think we have reason to be like, we call humans generally intelligent, but like, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a combustible definition of human intelligence. And so the idea of making it artificial is hard because we don't really know what the thing we're trying to make artificial is. So it's we're discovering that. I mean, AI,
Right.
the quest for AGI is in some sense a philosophical journey of like human self-discovery.
Right.
Um, and I think that we're learning interesting things all the time about that. And I think there's a reasonably high probability that the companies, these AGI companies will be successful in the sense that they will make a system that can do anything a person can do on a computer.
Mm.
Now,
Anything, just to clarify in case people don't get it, anything a person using a computer can do.
yes,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So
not hit a baseball.
right, exactly. I mean, maybe one day, right? Maybe we'll also have the robotics is making progress too.
Yeah.
And that's an AI story as well. But yeah, I think what these companies are working on right now is like kind of think of as drop-in knowledge worker, automated
Right.
knowledge worker for any profession. But there's a lot more to human intelligence than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our ability to model other people is really quite good, right? Like I can intricately tell you the details of like my friend's theory of mind, right? I have like a detailed theory of mind on everyone I'm close with. But I don't really know, like I don't have a detailed theory of how the molecules inside of my desk are doing.
Right.
Right. So there's like different kinds of things that I think we'll excel at or not excel at. And one other thing to consider is that if you think of the small AI models you're talking about as tools,
right.
Well, when and if you have general intelligence, one thing a general intelligence could do is make small models and use them to do things, right?
Yeah.
It could also work on itself, right? It could also like work on frontier AI research.
Right.
So
right.
I think we'll see about that. I think it is kind of the big question to a certain extent. And I think it's at the moment outstanding.
Yeah. So we touched briefly on the sort of physical world, and I want to pull together a couple things. One is you wrote an interesting essay about El Segundo.
Mm-hmm.
And El Segundo, for those who are not from Southern California, is a separately incorporated town that's just south of LAX, the airport. And traditionally, it was the place where there was a lot of aerospace industry. There still is some, but there's not as much in the area as there once was. And for those who are fans of A Tribe Called Quest, it looks absolutely nothing like the desert town in that video, their El Segundo video, but it's near the coast and it's full of office buildings. It's pretty nice. Anyway, so you wrote a post about what's going on there now. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So El Segundo has become a kind of hub for a small but growing community of what Silicon Valley calls hard tech startups. So that's defense technology, manufacturing, things like that. This really all got started. The seed of all this was that El Segundo was SpaceX's original headquarters.
Yes, right.
So that's where,
which is in keeping with its traditional role in the local economy and the national economy too.
Yeah. So, nowadays you have startups there, and these are real startups. I mean, scrappy organizations that are working on like nuclear microreactors that can fit on the back of a truck, or rockets, hypersonic missiles, really advanced manufacturing technology.
Right.
And it's kind of it's an interesting comparison with what I see when I go to Silicon Valley and San Francisco and the AI world, because the community in El Segundo, I would say, kind of skeptical of the generalist AI models, of ChatGPT and stuff like that. Not using them that much, and kind of skeptical of their whole enterprise. Very interested in the physical world.
Right.
Very interested in building things and kind of making a series of artistic and philosophical statements about the direction that America should be headed. Or if not artistic, then aesthetic. It's it's just really interesting to see, and it's like an alternate reality of the 21st century where a number of political threads of the 21st century didn't happen, but it's still super high tech.
Right. So, what are the aesthetic, cultural, political, whatever statements that they're kind of making? What are the...
So I would say I wouldn't characterize it as being like a super conservative place, but definitely you meet more founders there who are openly and proudly conservative. You see Trump flags in El Segundo, which is, it's Los Angeles,
Yeah, well, as you go south, there's El Segundo, and then you have to skip over the beach cities, Manhattan Beach or most beach, and then you get to places where there's a lot of oil refineries and stuff traditionally. So south of LAX, there is a kind of strip that's a little less coastal than some of politically.
Yeah. And I would say also, you have, it's a lot of times you meet people either who are young and fresh out of college, the founders, or they sort of pursued careers in more traditional 21st century professions and got bored, got disaffected. They didn't want to move numbers around in Wall Street or write code in Silicon Valley. They wanted to have a tangible impact on the world. And they, so like, they're kind of making a statement against traditional knowledge work. That being said, it's not like they don't use computers. They're often using computers in very sophisticated ways.
Right. These are very smart, knowledgeable people. It actually, I like this because it agrees with what I think, of course, which is that, first of all, just there's this general craving in the culture for physical efficacy, which manifests itself mostly in hobbies, which range from like MMA and weightlifting to various making things. And people who know me know that I learned to weave, and so I'm part of that whole fiber arts world too. But the other thing is, so I have to tell a story about two nephews of mine. One who lives in Pasadena, and his moms are in Pasadena. He grew up there, South Pasadena. He found high school boring except for woodworking class. He dropped out of high school and took something that California has that's like the GED, but it's not the GED because it's for people who are still high school age. Then he went to community college and studied got a degree in woodworking and carpentry. He's very smart and gifted at this. And he first worked for a high-end furniture maker. And now he's doing very high-end construction. So that's one guy. And that's like a traditional, crafts, carpenter's been around forever at some level, although he also, anyway, but the other is, I have a nephew who's a recent Georgia Tech graduate who's working in Silicon Valley. But what is he doing? He's making medical robotics. He's doing medical robotics, and he can't talk about it because it's all secret. And he and his girlfriend talk about how they really, really want to have their own machine shop someday, basically just as something to fool around with. So, that's two data points but they are from opposite sides of the family, one from my husband's side and one from mine, and very different paths, but they both have this sort of making things in the real world quality. So I think there is something sort of bubbling up in the culture that attracts people to that.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about El Segundo that reminds me a tiny bit of your book, The Fabric of Civilization, is just the interesting ways in which ideas from sort of recent technological developments are being combined and mixed and matched in all kinds of, my favorite example of this, just because it's so potent, is there's people who worked on rocket design at SpaceX.
Right.
They designed the Raptor engine that's inside of SpaceX's rockets, and they are now designing a system that is basically a rocket engine that can turn plant matter into electricity and clean water.
Okay, from a rocket engine. This
it's complex, weird science.
yeah.
But there's all kinds
I
of.
assume there's a lot of chemistry involved, which is the science we never talk about anymore because it's got a bad rep.
Yeah, well, and they do all kinds of. I mean, there's so many different things like that that are going on where it's basically just people taking academic ideas that have been around, some cases for a few decades, and then just kind of that were ahead of their time, that were just not practical, and then just kind of realizing, oh, wait a minute, electric motors are now far cheaper than they used to be.
Right.
Or we know how to make rocket engines way more efficiently and how to kind of mass produce them a little bit more than we used to. There's new materials that are available. 3D printers are available. There's all these different things. And so they're combining sort of academic ideas and recent technology in all kinds of interesting ways. Right. And software. Software is a hugely important part of all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of this, when I go around and I talk to people about, this is more like in synthetic biology and other things, like, well, could you have done this 10 years ago or 20 years ago? The response is often, well, in theory, you could have, but it would have been way too expensive. And so, Moore's law is behind a lot of advances in fields that aren't computing per se, aren't AI per se.
Right.
Including, I talked to somebody, this is maybe 10 years ago, but they were doing robots that could sew with fabric, which is actually really hard because it's floppy. And but that was one of their answers, was that, the sensors of being able to see where the fabric was and how it was behaving had gotten much cheaper.
Yeah. Same thing is true. And that's how fracking became, a live possibility. Also, it feels as though we are on the cusp of some real breakthroughs with commercial nuclear fusion, which is when you...
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Yeah, and if that happens, it's going to be because of AI and computers being faster. Like it'll be because of other things too, but at some fundamental level, that will be an enabling part of the technology.
Can you explain how what that connection is?
Yeah, absolutely. So nuclear fusion, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but in essence, it involves replicating
not to do it.
or not to do it. Yeah, it involves replicating the inner workings of a star. In a machine controlled here on Earth. Now, part of the reason a star is able to fuse atoms together is that it's very heavy, and so the gravity, pushes them together. It's also very hot, but it's mostly that it's very heavy. We don't have that gravity here on Earth, so you have to get to much higher temperatures than So we're talking about temperatures that are hotter than the sun in facilities that are here on Earth. And basically what you do is you heat up gas to the point that it's a plasma to, 100 million degrees, say, in that vicinity. And as you can imagine, and you in some kind of a chamber, and then you put the plasma either at very high speed, or you kind of like slam different chunks of plasma into one another such that fusion occurs. And as you can imagine, this is like a very tempestuous situation to have, 100 million degree plasma going 1 million miles an hour. It's like literally what's happening. So in order to control that, you need very sophisticated and exotic magnets of various kinds often. And these magnets, though, they have to be controlled in extremely precise ways, oftentimes with nanosecond levels of precision. And so a lot of the breakthroughs that you're seeing is A, because we're finding better magnets. We're discovering better magnets. But B, because we're discovering new AI-based systems to control those magnets and other parts of the fusion system to keep the plasma under control. There's this one example, a company called Helion, where it's basically like a tunnel. And on opposite sides of the tunnel, you have 2 million degree levitating donuts of plasma, and you heat them up to 100 million degrees, and then you fire them at each other at 1 million miles an hour. And you do that like 10 times a second, maybe, eventually, is their hope. They currently can do it like once a second, maybe once every 10 seconds, something like that.
That, when you think about it, forget the fusion, just the fact that people can do this is really amazing.
Yeah, and to be clear, this all does happen, right? Like levitating 100 million degree donuts going at 1 million miles an hour is a thing that happens routinely here on Earth. Uh, but yeah, like lining that tunnel are these magnets, and they're just wired together with super, super dense, kind of like computing cables, the data cables, fiber optics that can communicate data to and from. And then there's AI systems that are controlling those magnets as it's going through a tunnel, which is not that big, maybe like 20, 30 feet at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And there's like a dozen magnets on each side. So, I mean, you're talking about...
And I'm just wondering, what are those cables made out of?
Yeah.
Like, how do they not melt or sublime? Yeah.
It's well, because it's all on it's like it's really, what is the tunnel made out of? It's made out of this very impressive material. Right. Yeah, but it's really cool stuff. And it's kind of it's a story about material science and AI.
Right. Yeah, and I'm very into materials, and have a new article out about materials libraries, which is a very different sort of materials, really, or coming out of design, product design or interior design, but that was part of an initiative for Works in Progress of assigning a lot of articles to other people about materials as well.
Oh,
cool. So let me just look and see what I haven't asked you that I want to be sure. Oh yes, okay. Back to your career. So you work at the Mercatus Center, which is a think tank at George Mason University. The director is Tyler Cowen, whom I'm sure many people know the work of. And to me, Mercatus is very mysterious, because I know that there are people who are on the faculty at George Mason who are affiliated with the Mercatus. And then there are a lot of people like you who may or may not, but often don't have PhDs, but are doing sort of intellectual work. And I'm just curious, explain to people, what is this place like? How did you get your job? What is this institution that you work for?
Yeah, so it's a really cool place that kind of focuses on a fascinating diversity of issues, a sort of very, if you know Tyler Cowen, a very Tyler-esque pastiche of different things. And the goal, like a lot of sort of think tanks, is have an influence in targeted areas of domestic policy. So people to focus on housing. We have people to focus also on policy in India, though. So not just domestic.
I've been on Shruti's podcast, which was great. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And so it's a wonderful place. I got my job here in some fundamental way, I think, by emailing Tyler Cowen posts to my Substack until he hired me. But yeah, basically, I mean, pretty much for me, it was like, I realized that if I wanted to get hired by a place, I had one this essay on Oakeshott that was like 30 pages. And then I adapted that into something that got accepted at a journal called National Affairs.
Right.
And then I thought I could maybe get hired on the basis of that. And it turned out like, no, not really. So I started a Substack because I decided that I needed a writing portfolio. And so I just kind of started sending it. And I found it to be wonderful. I found that I have a great deal of independence, intellectual independence. And that's really important for AI because, in particular, if things like AGI are real near-term technologies, while I think that classical liberalism it will not go out of style, will not go outdated.
Right.
I do think that it's going to challenge political institutions or create new sort of territories of human activity almost that feel political, but because AI is capital essentially, will probably be capitalistic enterprises.
Yeah.
And so I mean, you can argue that OpenAI itself in the long term, if they build AGI, is an example of such a company. So there's like new types of institutions that I think we need to build. And we have to use classical liberal principles to build them, but fundamentally, very few classical liberal thinkers will have ever contemplated this kind of thing.
Right.
So Yeah. So I think that having intellectual freedom, in other words, is very important for this area in particular, because it's not like an area where it's a little more predictable what the kind of pro-market response would be.
Like housing or something, which
yeah.
And,
build more of it.
Yeah, I think that is really important. That's just an important point in general, that and it is one of the differences between these, ill-defined terms, but that I understand the difference between classical liberalism, which is just a part of a long-standing intellectual stream, and American libertarianism, which is a very specific, mostly post-war phenomenon that's much more formulaic. But it also reminds me that one of the challenges to classical liberalism and why it fell out of favor, fell out of style for a long time, was that it didn't really have answers in the late 19th and early 20th century to the question of, well, if you can plan a railroad, why don't we just take those tools that are so great in these large enterprises, steel companies and rail companies and car companies, and apply them to the whole economy and make it more efficient, and all of these things. I mean, that was a line of reasoning in the early 20th century, and it starts in the late 19th. And classical liberals didn't really have great answers to that until Hayek started thinking about the uses of knowledge in society and that sort of thing. And so you're anticipating something similar, I think.
There are people who also think that AI will kind of enable like new levels of central planning.
And exactly. Yes.
And I'm skeptical of that for the following basic reason, that I actually think that neural networks are like the ultimate revenge of the classical liberals in a certain sense, because there's all these things, right? All these like the prediction of protein structures, or the state of plasma in a nuclear fusion reactor. There's really things in nature that, we have equations, we have mathematical equations, and we have rules that theoretically govern how stuff works in a kind of Newtonian way. And it turns out that when it comes to a complex system, those rules are oftentimes approximately useless in allowing us to make useful predictions about what will happen, right? Like, and the reason for that is that they are emergent orders. And it turns out that like what you need is not to use computers to find new rules. You create an emergent order that can understand the emergent order, which is what a neural network is, right? And a neural network is itself is kind of a self-adaptive emergent system. And so like how do you I think that that's interesting. I think that that's like a really deep and interesting fact. It probably says also like that's how we work too, right? We don't learn rules to a girl who's learning to catch a football or a baseball is not learning the laws of physics to do so.
Right. Yes. And I think there's an important distinction also between being able to look at a phenomenon that has happened and explain why it happens, which might be difficult, a very difficult question in itself, but it is more likely to be possible than to predict what will happen.
Yeah.
So, and of course your explanation may or may not be correct. That's the other thing. But I do think that, biologists and economists do like know real things about the world, but that doesn't mean they can necessarily predict all the things that will happen.
And there's also this strange disconnect that I don't entirely understand, where it kind of feels like science, the science community, stopped communicating new things to the public like 50 years ago. New deep truths. There's little things, right? Oh, CRISPR, things like that the public is aware of. But like when Einstein communicated to the world, he was communicating something that was like very deep about the nature of our universe. And I think that those lessons, they became very complicated. They became kind of unappealing. But it kind of feels like starting just after Einstein, that stopped happening. And so there's all these things that biologists are well aware of. That that the public still thinks, oh, well, you kind of have this intuitive sense that, oh, well, maybe we can just come up with like a list of rules that define protein folding. And it's like, no, probably not.
Well, to be fair, the general public has no idea that there's such a thing as protein folding, which may get to your point that about science communication.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
But anyway, well, we're coming to the end of our hour, and I want to ask you sort of a very general question, which is, aside from reading your Substack, which I highly recommend, what do you recommend people to read? Not necessarily to understand AI, but just like, what do you think is great reading? Could be books, could be online places.
Yeah. I mean, I would have to say Oakeshott would be on the list. His book, Rationalism in Politics, would absolutely be a recommendation. I think that there's so many great Substacks on the right now that it'd also be
talk
hard
about an emergent order. Substack is itself a great example of that.
Completely. I think that in that category I would certainly put Brian Potter, the Substack Construction Physics.
Yes,
it's all about different things in the physical world. That's a wonderful one. Patrick McKenzie, Patio 11 as he's known, his writing on sort of the financial services industry and how things actually work is great. That's not a Substack, but it is a kind of similar format. A lot of people like that. There's so many good ones.
You don't have to give an exhaustive list. We know you read tons and tons of stuff. I just want to help listeners find new things that might interest them.
Let me give one other book that I think is that came out recently that I think is worth reading. It's called How Life Works by Philip Ball.
Yeah.
No relation to me as far as I know. Philip was an editor at Nature for a long time. And so he's not a professional biologist, but he's been exposed to a lot of different science. And he just wrote this wonderful book about sort of how we should think about life and how what kind of actually he's doing what I was just saying. He's communicating deep truths about science in a way that is it's not the simplest book in the world. It is fairly complicated, but I think that a curious reader will get a lot from it. And I wrote a review of it on my Substack as well. And that would be one I'd highly recommend.
I'll add a link to that in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being my first Substack podcast interview subject. And
it's an honor. I really appreciate it. Right. And I hope we can talk again sometime soon.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining me for this conversation with Dean Ball. Check out the show notes for more information on some of the things we talked about, and please subscribe to hear more podcasts. My next conversation will be with Joel Miller of Miller's Book Review. Hope to see you then.